October 1347. A harbor on the northern coast of Sicily. 12 Genoese galleys come in from the sea, riding low in the water. The men who tie them up find most of the crews already dead. The survivors are covered in black swellings the size of eggs. In the world we know, the harbor master lets them dock. Within 6 months, a third of the people he can see from his window will be dead. Within 4 years, a third of the entire continent. But what if he hadn't? What if those 12 ships had been turned back into the Mediterranean before a single rat came down a single rope? What would the next 700 years of human history have looked like? To understand this alternate history, you have to first understand how thin the line really was. The Black Death did not arrive in Europe as a wave. It arrived as a handful of ships. In the autumn of 1347, a Genoese trading fleet that had been doing business in the Crimean port of Kaffa sailed home across the Mediterranean. By the time it reached Sicily, the plague was already aboard. And the way it got aboard is one of the strangest, darkest stories in the whole history of disease. Kaffa on the Black Sea coast was a Genoese trading colony. In the years before 1347, it was under siege by a Mongol army of the Golden Horde, and the plague, traveling the trade roads out of Central Asia, reached the besieging army first. According to a chronicler named Gabriele de Musi, the Mongol commander, watching his own men die in their thousands, did something monstrous. He had the plague-dead bodies of his soldiers loaded into catapults and hurled over the walls into the city. Historians today are genuinely split on whether that story is literally true or a half-legend told secondhand by a man who was not there. The disease may simply have crossed the walls the way it crossed everything else, on the back of a rat. But the chroniclers believed the catapult story, and they wrote it down, and it tells you something real either way. That people of the time understood in their bones that the dead and the dying could be carried and could be a weapon. However it got in, the Genoese in Kaffa fled by sea. Their galleys carried silk and grain and silver and, unknown to anyone aboard, the most lethal cargo in human history. A chronicler of the time, a friar named Michele da Piazza, wrote down what happened when they reached Sicily. The Sicilians, he says, saw the sickness on the sailors and tried to drive the ships away. They were too late. The plague had already stepped ashore. But notice the shape of that sentence. They tried to drive the ships away. The instinct was already there. The knowledge was already there. Medieval people understood in a rough and practical way that sickness traveled with the sick. What they lacked was speed. The plague moved faster than the decision to act on it. The ships docked, the cargo came off, the rats came off with the cargo, and only then did the harbor understand what it had let in. And the disease they let in was something Europe had no defense against at all. Modern science knows it as a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, carried in the gut of fleas, and the fleas carried on the black rat. In its most common form, it attacked the lymph nodes, raising the swellings, the buboes, that gave the bubonic plague its name. In another form, it reached the lungs, and then it no longer needed the rat or the flea at all. It traveled, lung to lung, on a single cough, across a single room. None of that was understood in 1347. To the people of the time, it was simply a darkness without cause. Some blamed a conjunction of the planets. Some blamed bad air rising from the ground. Some blamed the sins of the age. What almost no one could do was the one thing that worked: keep the sick and the ships that carried them far enough away, fast enough. In our timeline, that gap, the gap between the ships arriving and the harbor reacting, was about a day, maybe 2. So the question is not whether the Black Death could have been stopped. The question is what one day, one decision, one harbor master with a faster instinct would have done to the next 7 centuries. In the real world, the plague entered Europe because nobody in that harbor had the authority, or the nerve, to refuse the ships fast enough. In our alternate timeline, one man does. His name does not survive in any chronicle, because in this timeline he never becomes famous. He becomes the man because of whom nothing happens. Call him the port officer of Messina. He's the man whose job it is to decide which ships may unload. On the morning the Genoese fleet arrives, he rows out to the lead galley himself. He has done this 1,000 times. This time, he climbs the rope ladder, puts his head over the rail, and sees the deck. He sees the dead. He sees the black swellings on the living. And he does the thing that, in our timeline, the Sicilians only thought to do a day too late. He goes back down the ladder. He orders the harbor chain drawn across the mouth of the port. He sends armed men in boats to keep the galleys offshore. And he tells the Genoese captains, in plain words, that no man and no sack and no animal will come off those ships while he is alive to prevent it. This is not a fantastical act. This is the entire point. 40 years later, the city of Ragusa would do exactly this by law, hold arriving ships offshore for a fixed number of days before allowing anyone to land. The tool existed in the medieval mind. It simply had not yet been invented on the one morning when it would have mattered most. The fleet sits at anchor outside Messina for 19 days. Most of the remaining crew die where they are. The survivors eventually sail on, and the plague sails on with them, out into open water, looking for a harbor with a slower man in charge. It does find other harbors. It always does. A galley reaches Genoa. A galley reaches Marseille. Small outbreaks flare on the coast, and in our alternate timeline they are real, and they are frightening, and they kill thousands. But they are contained. One port, then another, learns the lesson of Messina fast. Chains go across harbor mouths. Ships are held offshore. The plague is fought as a series of fires rather than allowed to become one single inferno, and it never again finds what it found in our timeline. An entire trading network, wide open, all at once. And here we should be honest about the limits of this story. An alternate history is not a fairy tale. In this timeline, the plague is not destroyed. The bacterium still exists. It still lives in the rodents of Central Asia, as it does, quietly, to this very day. It will still, now and then, reach a European port and kill a few thousand people before the chains and the isolation choke it back down. So this is not a Europe with no plague. It is a Europe that learned to fight the plague one ship early instead of one ship late, and was therefore never broken by it. The difference between those two things is not a cure. It is the difference between a fire in one building and a fire that takes the whole city. That is the divergence. Not a cure, not a miracle. Just one man who said no on the right morning, and a continent that this time was quick enough to learn from him. To understand what was saved, you have to understand what was lost. In our timeline, the Black Death reached the Italian mainland by the start of 1348. Florence by spring, Paris by summer, England by the autumn, Scandinavia and the edge of Russia within 2 more years. By the time it had finished its first pass, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone in Europe was dead. Not 1/3 of the soldiers, not 1/3 of the poor, 1/3 of everyone. Priests, children, merchants, kings' daughters, entire villages with no one left to bury the last body. It is almost impossible to hold that number in your head, so historians sometimes put it another way. If the same proportion of people died in a modern Western country today, over 4 years, you would be burying someone you personally knew every week for years without pause. The chroniclers of our timeline strained to describe it. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio said that the dead were so many that they were laid in trenches, in layers, like cargo in the hold of a ship, with a little earth thrown between each layer. In Siena, a man named Agnolo di Tura wrote that he buried his 5 children with his own hands. He added the sentence that has echoed for 700 years. He wrote, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world." In our alternate timeline, the winter of 1347 into 1348 is simply a winter. A hard one, a hungry one in places, but the churchyards do not overflow. The trenches are not dug. The chroniclers who, in our world, filled page after page with the end of the world, write instead about the harvest, and a border dispute, and the price of wool. Agnolo di Tura in this timeline does not bury his 5 children. He has an ordinary, difficult, complete medieval life, and he is remembered by no one, because he never had to write the sentence that in our world made him impossible to forget. And it is not only people who survive, it is places. In our timeline, the Black Death did not just kill, it erased. Across England alone, historians have counted well over 1,000 villages that were inhabited before the plague and simply gone afterward. Not burned, not conquered, just abandoned, one empty house at a time, until the last family walked away, and the roofs fell in, and the fields went back to grass. You can still find them today. A walker crossing an English meadow will sometimes see in low evening light a pattern of grassy humps and hollows, the buried foundations of a street that the plague emptied 700 years ago. In our alternate timeline, those 1,000 villages are not lost. They are simply villages. Their churches hold services. Their fields are plowed. Their names, which in our world survive only as faint marks in a meadow, are in this timeline just the ordinary names of ordinary places where people live. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. In the timeline we are imagining tonight, the single deadliest event in European history does not happen, and almost no one alive at the time ever knows how close it came. Here is the difficult part of this episode. The Black Death was a catastrophe. It was also, by a brutal accident, one of the great engines of change in European history. To imagine the world without it, you have to be honest about what it did. Before the plague, Europe was crowded. For 3 centuries, the population had been climbing, and by 1347, there were more people than the farmland could comfortably feed. Wages were low because workers were many. Land was expensive because people were many. A peasant was, in the cold accounting of the age, cheap. The plague reversed that overnight. When 1/3 to 1/2 of all workers die in 4 years, the survivors become valuable. Suddenly, a laborer can demand higher pay, and if his lord refuses, he can simply walk to the next valley, where another lord, desperate for hands, will pay more and ask no questions. In our timeline, this is exactly what happened. Wages rose. Rents fell. Land lay empty and cheap. The rigid medieval system that bound a peasant to one lord and one patch of earth, the system we call serfdom, began, for the first time in centuries, to come apart. The lords fought it hard. In England, just 2 years after the plague, the Crown passed a law, the Ordinance of Labourers, that tried to force wages back down to what they had been before. It tried to make it a crime for a worker to ask for more, and a crime for a lord to offer it. It did not work. You cannot legislate away a shortage of human beings. The pressure kept building. In 1381, it broke. Tens of thousands of English peasants and craftsmen marched on London in what we now call the Peasants' Revolt. They burned tax records. They demanded the end of serfdom to the king's face. The revolt was crushed, and its leaders were executed. But the world it was protesting against did not come back. Across the next century, serfdom in Western Europe slowly, unevenly, died. Historians still argue about how much of this the plague caused. These forces were tangled together, and no honest historian claims the plague did it all alone. But almost none of them argue that it did nothing. So now, hold the alternate timeline up against that. In the world where the plague never comes, none of that pressure is released. Europe stays crowded. Wages stay low. Land stays expensive. The peasant stays cheap. And the great loosening, the slow death of serfdom, either does not happen or happens far, far later and far more slowly than it did in the world we know. A man born unfree in this alternate 1360 may now live his whole life unfree. So may his son. So may his son's son. The chain that in our timeline the plague helped to snap holds in this one for generations longer. And there is a quieter consequence here, one that historians find genuinely intriguing. When labor is scarce and expensive, there is a powerful reason to invent machines that do the work of hands. Some historians have argued that the labor shortage after the Black Death gave Europe exactly that incentive, a push toward water mills, toward better tools, toward doing more with fewer people. It is not a settled argument, but hold it up against the alternate timeline. A Europe drowning in cheap labor has the opposite incentive. Why build a costly machine when 10 hungry men will do the same work for bread? In the crowded timeline, the pressure that rewards invention is weaker, and the long European drift toward labor-saving technology may run slower and start later than it did in the world we know. So, let us follow that thread forward. What does a Europe that stays crowded actually look like? The first answer is the grim one. A population that keeps growing against a fixed amount of farmland does not grow forever. It runs into a wall. In our own real history, Europe had already started hitting that wall before the plague. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed perhaps 1/10 of the people in northern Europe. Years of cold and relentless rain rotted the crops in the fields. People ate the seed grain they should have saved for spring. Then they ate the animals. Then, in the worst-hit regions, there are accounts of people eating bark, and accounts of worse than that. In our timeline, the plague struck 30 years later, and in the most terrible way imaginable, solved the overcrowding. Fewer people, more food for each of them. For the survivors, in the bleakest accounting, there was suddenly enough. In our alternate timeline, that release valve never opens. So the late 14th century in this imagined Europe is most likely a century of famines. Not one great famine, a series of them. Bad harvest after bad harvest, falling on a population with no slack, no margin, no spare grain. and famine does the killing that the plague did, but it does it differently. Plague kills fast, and it kills nearly everyone in its path, rich and poor, young and old, the careful and the careless alike. Famine kills slowly, and famine kills the poor first. A wealthy family can buy bread at almost any price. When grain is scarce and the cost triples, a merchant simply pays triple. A laborer's family cannot. They eat less. Then they eat badly. Then the children sicken because a starving body cannot fight off the ordinary illnesses that a fed body shrugs away. So this crowded alternate Europe is not just poorer, it is more unequal. The catastrophe still comes, it almost always does, but it lands this time not on everyone, but almost entirely on the people at the bottom. And famine does not only kill, it also breaks things. A hungry population is a frightened population, and a frightened population goes looking for someone to blame. In our own timeline, hard years in medieval Europe routinely produced exactly that. Pogroms against Jewish communities, witch panics, the hunting of outsiders and lepers and the poor. A crowded alternate Europe, lurching from one famine to the next, with no plague to ever thin the pressure, is a Europe with more of those years. More fear, more scapegoats, more blood spilled by neighbors in the name of a hunger that no one understood. There is a grim irony hiding in that. In our timeline, the Black Death itself triggered some of the worst pogroms in medieval history. Whole Jewish communities, from Strasbourg to the Rhineland, accused of poisoning the wells and massacred. So the alternate timeline does not escape that horror. It simply trades one engine of it for another. The slow grind of hunger in place of the sudden terror of the plague. The plague, for all its horror, was at least indifferent. It took the bishop and the beggar with the same hand. Famine is not indifferent. Famine reads a person's rank before it decides whether to kill them. Some of the deepest changes the plague set loose were not about wages or food at all. They were about belief. In our timeline, the medieval Catholic Church met the Black Death and, in a quiet way, never fully recovered from it. Consider what the plague did to ordinary faith. People prayed and died anyway. They confessed their sins and died anyway. They walked in processions carrying relics through the streets, and the processions, packing the sick and the well together, often spread the disease faster. Whole monasteries full of the most devout and disciplined men in Europe were wiped out to the last brother. And the parish priest faced an impossible position. Their duty was to sit with the dying and give the last rites. To do that duty was, very often, to catch the plague and die of it. Some priests fled their parishes to save their lives. Others stayed and did the duty and were buried by it. When the priest who stayed died, the church had to replace him fast, and the supply of trained men was running out. So the replacements were younger, more hastily ordained, sometimes barely able to read the Latin of the Mass. In many regions, the visible quality of the parish clergy simply fell, and the survivors were left with a terrible private question. If God had sent the plague as a punishment, what kind of punishment kills the newborn and the saint in the same week as the sinner? And if God had not sent it, then what exactly had the church been promising to protect them from? Some Europeans answered that question in a way that frightened the church badly. As the plague spread, a movement of flagellants swept across the continent. These were ordinary people, sometimes hundreds in a single procession, who walked from town to town, whipping their own bare backs until they bled, convinced that if they punished themselves hard enough, God might be persuaded to lift the plague. It was a movement born of pure desperation. But notice what it really was. It was ordinary people deciding that the official church was not enough, that they would deal with God directly. in the street, with a whip, and without a priest. The Church saw the danger in that at once. By 1349, the Pope had formally condemned the flagellants. But they had already shown something the Church could not unsee, that a frightened population, in a crisis the Church could not solve, would simply go around it. In our alternate timeline, there is no plague terror, and so there are no flagellant processions. That whole strange, fevered chapter of medieval religious history simply never happens, and the Church is never given that early, alarming preview of what its own people would do without it. In our timeline, this did not produce an instant rebellion. The faith of medieval Europe was deep, and it endured. But the plague produced a long, slow erosion. It fed movements that asked uncomfortable questions. The Lollards in England, who wanted scripture in plain English and fewer priests standing between a soul and God. The followers of Jan Hus in Bohemia, a full century before Luther. A rising hunger across Europe for a more personal, more direct faith. A century and a half later, that hunger would help feed the Protestant Reformation. None of this means the plague caused the Reformation. It did not. The Reformation had many fathers. But the plague cracked something. It taught a great many ordinary Europeans a lesson they did not forget, that the mighty institution standing between them and heaven could be helpless and frightened and wrong. In our alternate timeline, that lesson is never taught. The Church of the late 14th century is not humiliated by a catastrophe it cannot explain or stop. Its monasteries are intact, full of learned men. Its parish clergy are not thinned and hastily replaced. Its authority stands exactly as tall in the year 1400 as it stood in 1340. A more confident church, a less questioned church. When the great religious arguments of the 16th century finally come, and in some form they probably still do because their other causes remain, they arrive against an institution that has never once, in living memory, been seen to fail. Now we have to widen the lens, because the plague did not stay in Europe, and neither do its consequences. The Black Death almost certainly began in Central Asia and spread west along the trade roads of the Mongol world, the same roads that in peacetime carried silk and silver and spice. The disease struck the Middle East and North Africa as hard as it struck Europe. Cairo, one of the greatest cities on earth in 1347, may have lost something close to half its people. So, in our alternate timeline, where the plague is contained and never explodes, it is not only European villages that are spared. It is Damascus, it is Cairo, it is Baghdad and the cities of the Islamic world, and the trading ports of the Mongol successor states across the whole breadth of Asia. This matters enormously, because the 15th century in our real timeline was shaped more than anything by who was weak and who was strong when it began. Consider the Ottoman Empire. In our history, the Ottomans rose through a Middle East and a Balkans that the plague had repeatedly hollowed out. Plague weakened their rivals. Plague thinned the garrisons of the cities they besieged. In the year 1453, the Ottomans took Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city whose population had been ground down across a full century, partly by recurring waves of the very same disease. In the alternate timeline, the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean are all simply more populous. More populous means more soldiers on the walls. It means more taxpayers funding the treasury, more farmers filling the granaries, more resilience to absorb a bad year or a lost battle without collapse. A Constantinople with a century of uninterrupted population behind it is a far harder city to take. A Byzantine empire that the plague never gutted may survive deep into the 16th century or beyond. The Ottoman expansion does not stop. The Ottomans were a formidable power for many reasons beyond plague, but it slows. It bleeds for every single mile. And there is a deeper irony buried here. In our timeline, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 helped to choke off the old land routes by which Asian goods reached Europe. That pressure, the need to find another way to the wealth of the East, was one of the forces that pushed European powers out onto the open ocean. It is part of the long chain that ends in 1492 with Columbus sailing west. And the Islamic world itself would stand on different ground. In our timeline, the plague struck the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt again and again across the 14th and 15th centuries. Cairo, the jewel of the medieval Islamic world, was repeatedly hollowed out. Its population fell. Its irrigation works, which needed many hands to maintain, decayed for lack of those hands. Historians count the recurring plague among the slow, grinding causes of the Mamluk decline. In the alternate timeline, that grinding pressure is lifted. A Mamluk Egypt that the plague never repeatedly gutted is wealthier, more populous, better defended. It may not fall to the Ottomans in 1517 as it did in our world. The whole balance of power across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East tilts onto a different axis. So change who holds Constantinople. Change who holds Cairo. Change when or whether the old powers fall. And you have reached out across 100 years and put your hand on the date that European ships first crossed the Atlantic. There is one consequence of the plague that historians argue about more than almost any other: the Renaissance. For a long time, there was a tempting story. The Black Death emptied Europe. The survivors inherited the wealth of the dead. A merchant who lived suddenly held the estates, the houses, and the gold of 3 or 4 relatives who had not. All that concentrated wealth, the story went, flowed into art, into grand architecture, into the rebirth of classical learning that we call the Renaissance. Modern historians are far more cautious about that story. The Renaissance had deep roots that ran back well before 1347. Italian banking, the rediscovery of Greek and Roman texts, the restless wealth of the trading cities, all of that was already in motion while the plague ships were still at sea. But few historians would say the plague had no effect at all. Think about what a labor shortage does to the value of a skilled person. When ordinary workers are scarce, a gifted painter, a brilliant architect, a clever engineer becomes something that a wealthy city or a prince will compete to employ. Scarcity raised the price, and just as importantly, the status of human talent itself. And there is a darker thread. The plague filled European art for a century with death. A new kind of image spread across the continent, the dance of death, in which grinning skeletons lead away the Pope and the Emperor and the laughing child in one long procession, all ranks equal, all bound for the same grave. A new and unflinching attention to the human body, to suffering, to the plain fact of mortality. That confrontation fed something real in the art and the philosophy that followed. So picture the Renaissance in our alternate timeline. It is not erased. The banks of Florence still rise. The lost classical texts are still recovered and copied. The trading wealth still pools in Venice and Florence and Bruges. But it is, most likely, slower, more crowded, less hungry for human skill. Because in a crowded continent, skilled hands are not scarce, and a patron need not compete so hard to command them. And its art is haunted by death far less, because death in this timeline has not just walked slowly and openly through every street in Europe. There is one more strand worth pulling here, and it concerns the printed word. In our timeline, the printing press arrived in Europe around the year 1450, roughly a century after the Black Death. By then, the plague had reshaped the ground the press would land on. Paper had become cheaper, partly because the plague survivors had more linen rag to spare. Wages were higher, which meant more ordinary people who could afford a book and had a reason to read. In the crowded alternate timeline, the press still gets invented. It was, in the end, a mechanical idea, and clever people were always going to have it. But it may spread into a poorer, more crowded, less literate world. A world where books reach fewer hands and reach them more slowly. And the printing press, remember, is one of the great accelerants of everything that follows, of science, of the Reformation, of the modern mind itself. A gentler renaissance, perhaps, a later one, a gradual one. One that, when you stand back from it across the centuries, may simply be a little quieter in every room and a little slower to light the fuse of the modern age. Let us follow the alternate timeline all the way down. Past the 14th century, past the 15th, into the deep modern consequences. Start with the most uncomfortable one. Population. In our timeline, the Black Death and its later return waves held Europe's population down for roughly a century and a half. The plague did not strike once and vanish. It came back in the 1360s, in the 1370s, again and again across generations. Europe did not climb back to its pre-plague numbers until around the year 1500, and later still in some regions. A crowded alternate Europe does not have that long pause. It keeps growing, earlier and faster. And a continent under harder population pressure for longer is a continent under more strain. More competition for every field. More younger sons with no land and no prospects. More pressure to push outward in search of room. The hungry expansionist energy that, in our world, eventually sent European powers across the oceans, might, in this timeline, burn hotter and turn outward even sooner. Now turn to medicine and to the machinery of public health. In our timeline, the plague was a horror, but horror is also a teacher. The recurring waves of plague across the next 3 centuries forced European cities, slowly and clumsily and at great cost, to invent the basic tools of organized public health. The very word quarantine comes from this. It comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, the period that the city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, began requiring arriving ships and travelers to wait in isolation before they could enter. Permanent boards of health, isolation hospitals outside the city walls, bills of mortality, the first rough, regular public counting of who had died and of what. Much of that early apparatus of the modern state was built by societies desperately trying to survive the plague. In our alternate timeline, that hard schooling is softer, and it comes later. A Europe that was never scourged the way ours was has far less reason to invent quarantine, far less reason to count its dead, far less reason to build the slow, unglamorous institutions of public health. And that produces a bitter possibility. When the next great pandemic comes, and across 700 years, something always comes, this alternate Europe may meet it more crowded, more unequal, and far less prepared. with far fewer of the hard-won tools than the Europe of our own history. There is one more consequence here, and it is the largest and the most haunting of all. It reaches across an entire ocean. When European ships finally reached the Americas, in our timeline, they carried disease with them: smallpox, measles, influenza, and more. The peoples of the Americas had no inherited resistance to any of it, and the result was the deadliest demographic catastrophe in all of recorded human history. Across the century after contact, by many estimates, something close to 90% of the entire indigenous population of the Americas died of imported disease. Now, this alternate timeline does not undo that. The diseases that crossed the ocean were not the plague. But remember what we established earlier. In this timeline, European contact with the Americas may come at a different time. Earlier, in a crowded and outward-pushing Europe, or later, depending on the fate of Constantinople. And it comes from a different Europe, more populous, more crowded, carrying its own particular mix of endemic sickness. Change the timing of contact by even a few decades, change which Europeans arrive and what they carry, and you change the precise shape of the worst catastrophe that ever befell a hemisphere. Not whether it happens. Almost certainly, tragically, it still does. But every detail of it, every people, every nation, every survivor, would be different. The plague did not only take. In the cruelest classroom ever assembled, it also taught. And a civilization that skips the lesson does not always, in the end, come out ahead. Nor does it leave the rest of the world untouched by what it failed to learn. Some changes ripple farther than ships and harvests. They reach into how a whole civilization sees itself. The Black Death left a permanent mark on the Western imagination. It is the original template for the end of the world. Every plague story written since, every vision of a city emptied by a silent sickness, every modern fear of a pandemic sweeping the globe is, in some part, a memory of the year 1347. It taught European culture a specific and lasting lesson, that catastrophe is not only possible, but ordinary. That a comfortable, busy, confident world can become unrecognizable within the span of a single year. You can hear that lesson echo through the centuries that followed. It is in the literature, the sense never quite absent from European art, that death is always in the room, always at the edge of the feast. It is in the institutions, the deep European instinct, which we traced in the last scene, to count, to record, to prepare, to keep a watch on the harbor. It is even, some have argued, in the European attitude toward life itself, a certain hard-won seriousness, a refusal to fully trust that the good years will simply continue. In our alternate timeline, that lesson is missing from the foundations of the culture. An alternate Europe that was never emptied may carry, all the way into the modern age, a deeper and more dangerous confidence. A quiet, unspoken assumption that the structures of ordinary life are simply permanent, that the harvest will come, that the city will stand, that tomorrow is reliably and forever a great deal like today. And there is one more thread, the hardest one of all to weigh. The Black Death, by killing without mercy and without distinction, killed an enormous amount of human potential. Somewhere inside that 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe were children who would have grown into great physicians, great builders, great minds, and great hearts. The plague erased them before the world ever learned a single one of their names. In our alternate timeline, those people live, all of them. Every gifted child the real plague killed in 1348 instead grows up and grows old and adds whatever they were going to add to the world. And yet, this is the uncomfortable heart of the whole episode. The timeline that saves all of those lives is not, obviously, the better timeline. It is more crowded. It is hungrier. It is more unequal, more rigid, slower to free the men and women born unfree, slower to question the institutions that fail it, slower to learn how to defend itself against the next great sickness. Both of those Europes are real possibilities. Both of them are honest readings of how history works. And both of them turn, in the end, on whether one unremembered harbor official climbed back down a rope ladder one cold morning in October and said the word, no. The harbor official of Messina, in our real timeline, does not exist. There was no one with a fast enough instinct. The ships docked. The cargo came off. The plague came ashore. And the man whose name we would honor today, if he had turned those galleys back to sea, is honored by no one. Because in our world, he never had the chance to do the thing that would have made him worth remembering. We tend to imagine that history turns on the great and the named, kings, generals, explorers, and popes. But the Black Death is a reminder that history also turns on harbor masters, on clerks, on the ordinary, forgettable person standing at an ordinary gate on the one morning when it happens to matter. We tell ourselves that history is the story of what happened. It is also, just as honestly, the story of what nearly did, and of all the quiet, unremembered people who did, or did not, say no in time.